morning, HASS members. We're excited to have you joining us. Excuse me, good afternoon, HASS members. We're excited to have you joining us for our presentation today, The Remarkable Career of Sculptor Richard Hunt, presented by Nancy Lausch. We'll be starting here in about 7 minutes, but love to have you join us if you want to turn your camera on to say hello. I'm curious of who JB73S is. If that is the name of your camera, could you turn your camera on or your audio on and let us know who you are?
She's not home yet, I would imagine. Marilyn. Oh.
Hi, Marilyn. Hope you're having a great afternoon. Looks like a comfortable spot for you. I saw Ann Melpolder said hi there a second ago.
Oh, there's
again, if you are JB73S, if you could let us know who you are, just it looks like you're unmuted now, so just tell us your name and we'll get you signed in here. Oh, it's Sarah Briggs. Well, welcome back, Sarah.
Oh, Sarah.
I should have known that was you. Should have recognized your iPad name there. I'm going to rename you here, Sarah, just so we don't forget who you are. Anne looks like she's enjoying her lunch this morning or this afternoon, which is a smart move on her part. Get fueled before class. I love it.
I think that's great. I'm going to be drinking water, so.
I hope it's a coffee and cookies, Anne, just to make you feel like you're part of the HASS group would be wonderful.
A tuna sandwich and grapes.
Oh, that sounds good too.
Okay, we'll get started here in about another 5 minutes or so. We'll be admitting more people as they join us here. Looks like Linda Byrne just joined us. Linda, hope you're having a great afternoon and ready to talk about some sculpture with us today. Great to have you joining us. Now, just a reminder, you don't have to have your camera off if you'd like to participate in today's class with the camera on. We'd love to see you. The only thing we ask, I'm sorry, I missed something. Was someone saying something there?
Yeah, I was going to say I have to have mine on, so.
Yeah. Nancy wants to see all of you, so if you are able to put your camera on, we'd love you to do so. I just see Sue Donnelly just joined us. Welcome, Sue.
They should be able to wiggle their name or something. Let you know they're there.
Well, we appreciate you all joining us even on such a nice weather day. Looks like it might be one of our last nice days here of the summer into fall season. I haven't been outside yet today, but I think it's almost up to 70 again here this afternoon. I see Sue Donnelly. Hi, Sue. And it looks like Jean Williams just joined us. Hi, Jean. Ready for class today, looks excited. We're happy to have you joining us. We'll get started here in about 3 minutes. So last chance to run to the restroom or grab that glass of water or something to snack on. Nancy's got a great class planned for you all today. A number of videos and some great photos to showcase some of the artwork of Richard Hunt. So you're in for a great one today. And we've got Phil Stockton coordinating the class from the same location as Nancy. So we've got a wonderful setup here in the HASS classroom. And hopefully you're all enjoying the comfort of your own homes this afternoon before we get started here. And I see Kathy Colton just joined us. Kathy, welcome. A new member. We're so happy to have you joining HASP and to join for this class. And you all know the drill. You've already muted yourselves, which is great. We have a smaller group today, so it'll be a nice chance for us to all get together and talk about the great work of Richard Hunt. Nancy does prefer we save questions till the end, but if you'd like, you can share them in the chat window throughout as they come to you, and we'll relay them at the end when we're ready to. Otherwise, you'll be able to come off mute and ask your questions directly to Nancy yourself, whichever you'd prefer. But as your microphone should be muted, your video certainly does not need to be. So if you'd like to give a wave to everyone who's joining us or just to say hi, you're welcome to do so. It's great to see all your faces. Jean there is waving hello. So excited to have you all join us. This virtual component is really fun. It's a great way for us to all stay connected, but also make it really convenient for everyone too. So thank you to Nancy for her prep work to get us to this point. And thank you all for joining virtually. I'm glad that this is a great avenue for us to use.
Jill, are you going to sit here when, are you going to sit here when you do? Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yes. Yes, your microphone picks me up.
Yeah.
You just tested.
And we are recording today's presentation, so if you'd like to revisit it later, it will be available on YouTube at the end of the term. So likely in the December time period, this will be available for you to view, and we'll make sure to inform you through the HASP Happenings Sunday morning message. So you'll have a link to access it directly and make it really easy for all of you.
I will get up so you can.
No.
You don't want to be on camera.
There's Kathy Colton. Great to see you, Kathy. Welcome. And I think my watch says 1 o'clock, Nancy. So I just want to give everyone a brief reminder here before we get started. Looks like I'm going to welcome Ben here. Right as we begin, we're just joining. Looks like Ben might be outside. Welcome, Ben. Are you sitting outside today?
Looks like he does it.
Got one more person entering here in a second, Nancy, and we'll get started.
Okay.
So again, just want to welcome everyone. If we have not had the chance to meet directly, my name is Ian McNeil, and I'm the director of HASP. Been in the position since June 1st. And this type of event is my favorite part of my job, is to sit and listen to the great work of HASP member Nancy Lausch as she presents her material on the remarkable work and career of Richard Hunt. We will certainly pass this off to the coordinator, who will present Nancy and get us kicked off. But I just want to remind you all that you can keep your microphones muted, but you do not need to mute your camera. If you want to say hi to everyone, give a little wave, or at least be visible, Nancy can see all of you, and she's excited to have your feedback, at least your facial expressions feedback, while she's presenting. So it feels like a simulated classroom. But if this is your first time joining us virtually, thank you for doing so. If this is one of your first classes with HASP in the fall, we're happy to have you back. And if you're a new member, thanks for joining us, and excited to have you joining this class today. Nancy has elected to save any questions you might have for her on the subject matter for the end of the presentation. But if you'd like, and you are able, so you can submit those in the chat window. That should be an option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Otherwise, when we get to the question and answer period, I will invite you to come off mute and address a question directly to Nancy if you'd prefer to do it that way as well. And seeing that we have a small group today, it's wonderful for you to join us. But if you have any specific questions, again, just keep those to the end and we'll have a great conversation here today. Nancy has some great video, so you want to make sure that your audio is turned up, because we have some great interviews directly with sculptor Richard Hunt, as well as some great video showcasing him at work. So saying that that's all been said now, I will turn things over to Phil Stockton, who is in the room with Nancy, and will introduce her briefly before she begins. Thanks, everybody.
Our presenter today is HASP member Nancy Vanderboom Lausch. She is a retired professor of art education. After first working as a graphic designer and program manager at Herman Miller She spent the remainder of her career teaching art, first at Grand Valley State University and then at the College for Creative Studies. She was named Professor Emerita in 2018. Lausch earned a BFA from Cardinal Stretch University and a Master's in Education from Grand Valley State University and a PhD from the Union Institute and University. Nancy?
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. And thank you all for joining today. As Ian mentioned, I will have a number of a variety of forms of information coming your way. So I'd like to begin with just a brief introduction and a little background on Richard Hunt. And then we'll move into some of his videos and a podcast and some films that were taken throughout his life. So we'll see him progress over the years from not only in age, as we all have, but also in his work. Just to the image, well, I guess you can see it. The image on your screen, 70 years of drawing in space, Richard Hunt. That is, I believe, the name of a recent publication of his work, 70 years of it. It's an absolutely stunning piece. So that is where I got a lot of the information. So that's not working. Okay. So born on Chicago's South Side in 1935, Hunt has become the most prolific living American sculptor of our time. Pictured here in his high school graduation photo in 1953, Hunt was painter and sculptor as a profession, an early premonition of his life to come. He attended the Junior School of Art at the Chicago Art Institute as a child and went on to graduate from the School of Art Institute in 1957 with a Bachelor of Art degree in art education, interestingly enough. One always needs a backup plan. He never did teach, but he certainly did make his way in the world of sculpture. In 1957, he traveled throughout Europe on one of his many fellowships where he married the first of his 3 wives. Returning to Chicago, Hunt established his first studio in the basement of his parents' home. Although he would establish numerous studios over the years, including a small one in Benton Harbor, Michigan, he remained in Chicago rather than move to New York because, as he said, better access to larger facilities and easier access to industrial material. Hunt is a talented and prolific sculptor that by the age of 19 was selected to participate with other notable artists in an exhibition in the Chicago Museum of Art. African-American heritage was an important part of his upbringing, but it did not drive his subject matter over the years. Even though you will hear it mentioned many times in the videos, Hunt strongly felt that he was an artist first. He is a descendant of enslaved people brought to Savannah, Georgia from West Africa. His father, born in 1901, and his mother, born in 1910, were both college educated. As a child, Richard swept the floor of his father's barbershop, listening to the men discuss politics, race, and religion. Richard and his mother made many trips to the museums located in the Chicago area. It was during this time that he fell in love with the African-American culture. Although Hunt's early work was often linear in design, almost wire sculpture in appearance, his work, he works with a variety of metals, including bronze, chrome, steel, and aluminum. Welding metals together, constructing casts, he preferred the assemblage process, believing that he can add and subtract as the work was progressing. His work evolved over the years. which you will see in the videos. In some respects, he is largely unrecognized, even though he has held many prominent positions in the world of art, including the National Endowment for the Arts Governing Board from 1968 to 1974, and also as a jurist for the Vietnam War Memorial Competition won by Maya Lin in 1981. He continued to be on the National Endowment for the Arts Board throughout most of his life. Hunt was a member of the New Sculpture Group in New York from 1957 to 1962, consisting of a collection of prominent internationally known sculptures. And the reason I said he's perhaps not as well known as others might be, in the 1970s, when I was an undergrad, my aesthetic textbook featured all of the members of that group with the exception of Hunt, which I found quite interesting. Although his public sculptures can be found across the country, they are primarily located in the Midwest. You can see on this map the location of Hunt's public sculptures, really largely focused in the Midwest and the Chicago area. His work is largely present in public spaces, corporations, colleges, and universities. He has been recognized with a retrospective at the MoMA and other notable art museums, including the Chicago Museum of Art, as well as the Crassell Art Center in St. Joe. And if you haven't ever gone down there, it's definitely worth the trip. It's a beautiful art center. His work, you can find his work in West Michigan at the Crassell Center in St. Joe, where he also has a satellite studio. Although he has work not only in St. Joe, he has it in many other locations, which I'll show you. This piece on the screen right now is titled "And You Sees," produced in 2002. It's welded stainless steel, and it's at Silver Beach County Park, which is just below the Crassell Museum. There we go. Also at the Crassell Center in St. Joe are two absolutely stunning pieces that form a bridge greeting you to the Art Center. They're titled "Rising Crossing Tides," and they were installed in 2018. And that's the year that the Crassell had a retrospective of his work. They're as I said, at the entrance to the Art Center. Also in Muskegon, Michigan, on Western and 3rd Street, he produced or installed a sculpture titled "Muskegon Together Rising," and he put that in 2008. And at the Frederick Meyer Garden Sculpture Park in Grand Rapids, I think he has more than one, but this piece was photographed by our own Ian, and he shared it with me while I was putting the presentation together. It's titled "Column of the Free Spirit," and it's bronze, produced in 2000. Interestingly enough, in 1999, he seemed to be doing quite a bit of work in this area, in this region, and he even had a show at the Holland Area Arts Council, but I can find no information on it. And I've just dug and met with people, and they have no memory of it. And I have no memory of it, and although I was quite busy during those years, so I'm fascinated with that. But he also has a piece in the African American Museum in Detroit, also done in 1999. So he was really quite active in this area at that time. Other locations that in the Michigan area are, one is at, let me back this up here. The North Campus courtyard at the Archive Library on the University of Michigan's campus. This is a wide angle shot that I took. I ran back, it was a rainy day. I ran back and wanted to get some images of his work. And if you can see way in the back here, well, it's hard. You can see one piece way back here, and it's sort of talking to this piece in the center. I then took some close-ups. They're companion pieces, and one is titled Peregrine Section 1975 and Historical Circle on the right, and they are of corten steel. So it demonstrates the variety of materials that he has come to work in. These were done in 1975. They were a commission done for a member of the board at that time. So to get a more personal understanding of who Richard Hunt is and the kind of work he has done over the years, I'd like to show a series of videos, beginning with this 15-minute film produced by the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1971 and brought to us by Phil Stockton, a HASP member.
The junkyards of the city, an eyesore and a problem to many, are for Richard Hunt the source of materials for his art. Hunt selects his materials with a sculptor's eye for shape form. These go with him. Chicago is Richard Hunt's town. His studio is in a neighborhood of small stores and homes on the north side. A hole in the wall is the entrance to his studio. A converted garage. Piled among the tools, these materials await the touch of his hand, the spark of his imagination. While he works, he listens to classical music. For him, it is a source of inspiration. Richard Hunt is an artist from Chicago's South Side. Starting his career in a small black community, he has become one of the few artists ever to achieve worldwide recognition in the first decade of his work. This is the story of Richard Hunt's self-discovery as an artist, of the development of his talent, and of the achievement that has brought him success.
I think it's interesting to point out that there's a lot of stereotype thinking about Negroes and Negro culture, and that some of this rubs off on individuals, and this may give a sort of distorted picture of their development. I really didn't have all that hard a time. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood called Inglewood. This area I grew up in is changing. Now it's part of the Black Belt on Chicago's south side. When I lived there, there was a small black community within the white community. There was a kind of small town quality to the neighborhood, and that was kind of interesting. This is all going. We always had flowers and a yard and a house of our own. My parents wanted to give their children a cultural education. They provided me with a kind of environment and encouragement that helped me get an early start in art.
His first experiments with sculpture were made in the basement of his father's barber shop before he took any classes.
I'd started taking some sculpture classes with Nellie Barr, who was sort of like maybe my first really important influence. That is, in terms of directing me toward a career choice as a sculptor. This was a very important thing at the time. Then I sort of began to take myself seriously as a sculptor and that sort of thing.
When Richard first came to my class, he was still very young, only 14 years old, I think. And before, he had never done any three-dimensional work, just a lot of sketching. And he also was interested in painting. But as soon as he started in the Sculptor and working three-dimensionally, he showed that this was really his medium. He showed not only talent, but he was deeply involved, or became deeply involved in his work. And he stayed with it in spite of many difficulties. He gave up many things in order to be able to continue with his work in Sculptor.
She had the ability as a teacher to make people feel they could do things that maybe they're afraid to do or something like that. Another thing was the influence of her personality and her experience as a sculptress. I came to see some of her soul, I guess, in the way it expressed itself in her work and her personality, and that's always helpful.
For all the help and encouragement of his teacher, Hunt still had to find his own way as an artist. Junkyards provided materials for his work and helped him to discover the sculptural possibilities in found objects. To develop the techniques he needed, he taught himself welding. As his skill in welding was perfected, his work became more complex and gained recognition. Recognition brought large commissions. Public commissions gave him the opportunity to design large-scale works. They were the beginning of a new development in his sculpture. Making scale models helps Hunt to clarify his ideas and allows him to experiment with new materials. Public commissions provided a different kind of challenge than the small-scale work he did in his studio. Hunt works on them in a factory using industrial materials.
Working in an industrial plant brings me more into contact with the reality of technology, conceiving and designing things that can be fabricated with industrial methods. In contrast to my earlier work, a different kind of creative thought process is involved. The environment for this kind of sculpture is an important consideration. When I'm working, I have to keep in mind how it will look outside, where it will be placed permanently. When I was commissioned to make a sculpture of John Jones, I had a different problem. Jones was the first Negro elected to public office in Illinois in 1871. I didn't want to use an abstract treatment because I wanted to have the forms of the sculpture symbolize the kind of struggle he had and how difficult it was for him as a Negro. I used the form like a block growing out of his foot to show the weight he had to bear as a Negro as he climbed, and the other block growing out of his shoulder to show how his burden held him down at the same time he was trying to climb. Combining these elements with a traditional pose was the way I chose to express his struggle. Jones was born during slavery. He was born free, and all his young life he had to escape being sold into slavery.
Hunt's sculpture of John Jones symbolizes the struggle of his people. Commissioned by the state of Illinois, the sculpture moves through the streets of Chicago to the University of Illinois campus. Richard Hunt's self-discovery as an artist continues. His work is shown in major museums around the world. He has become one of the great American sculptors of our time.
Right. Well, that was him and as a young man. In this next clip, we will hear Hunt discuss his work at mid-career through a podcast by the National Endowment for the Arts. And as I said earlier, we'll see his work progress, but we will also see, we'll see him age a bit.
It's been 48 years out of the 50 that I've been associated with the National Endowment, National Council on the Arts. And so I served from 1968 to 1974. It was a very exciting and exhilarating thing to be part of a group of such notable people in the arts, all the arts, and to try to think about what this federal program could do nationally to advance the cause of the arts.
That's sculptor and former member of the National Council on the Arts, Richard Hunt. And this is Artworks, the weekly podcast produced at the National Endowment for the Arts. I'm Josephine Reed. As you might know, this is the 50th anniversary of the National Endowment for the Arts, and we're reaching out to some of the many artists who have been affiliated with us throughout the years. Enter Richard Hunt, the brilliant sculptor who served on one of the earliest national councils on the arts. And just an FYI, the council serves as an advisory board to the chairman, reviewing and making recommendations for grants and initiatives. We were lucky when Richard Hunt was appointed. He had a reputation as one of the country's leading African-American abstract sculptors, a reputation that's only grown throughout the decades. Richard Hunt has never stopped experimenting and pushing the boundaries of metal. He's said, in some works, it's my intention to develop the kind of forms nature might create, if only heat and steel were available to her. Marrying the industrial to the natural, his steel, aluminum, and bronze pieces often convey the further paradox of both solidity and movement. And somehow, Richard Hunt also manages to create abstract pieces of sculpture that relate directly to African American history, like Jacob's Ladder or I've Been to the Mountain. Richard Hunt has been thinking about art and its relationship to public space for his entire career, in practice as well as theory. An early proponent of working with found objects, Hunt has received many, many awards and prizes. It's been said that Richard Hunt has completed more public sculptures than any other artist in the country. He certainly has made his mark on his hometown of Chicago, with more than 30 pieces of his work on view in libraries, universities, community centers, plazas, and parks. Richard Hunt was born in 1935 on the south side of Chicago, and he credits his mother for making sure that the arts were a part of his life.
Growing up in Chicago, I was fortunate to have a mother who had a great interest in the arts, primarily the performing arts. My sister and I were taken to concerts, recital at an early age, and without any prompting, I just liked to draw, you know.
You had a good arts education at your public school as well, didn't you?
I would say so. At that point in time, both grammar school and high school, arts programs were more a part of the general kind of education, reading, writing, arithmetic, and music and art. And in high school, I was what they call an art major. So instead of taking the year of art and year of music, I took a year of art and another year of art as an art major. But by that time, I had started to attend what was called a junior school at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago on Saturdays and in the summers. And that gave me a lot more access both to instruction and familiarity with the works at hand in the Museum of the Art Institute.
Was being an artist as a career, was that something that was even in your lexicon?
I would say, no, I didn't say I'm going to be an artist, let alone a sculptor when I grow up. It was just something one liked to do, enjoyed. And over time, there was a certain amount of positive reinforcement from family, from art teachers. When it came time to go to college, you know, I had 3 areas of interest: history, biological science, and art, sculpture in particular. I got a scholarship to the School of the Art Institute, to the college, and that helped me decide that maybe this was the possibility of a career.
But you got your degree in arts education.
That's correct. Well, hedging a little bit, you know.
Right, your plan B.
Right.
Well, being an artist, it's not an easy life. You're an amazingly talented artist, and I'd like to begin by you talking about how you moved into sculpture.
Well, again, going back to high school, so I was about a sophomore in high school at the time. Took this class, and there was a wonderful teacher who took a great interest in our students generally, and I thought in me in particular, because we got on, and I was very much encouraged by her, a woman named Nellie Barr, who was very important in directing me toward career in sculpture. I mean, I liked, once I started working three-dimensionally, to actually make things that took their form in space, you know, rather than as an illusion on paper or canvas. And like I say, I had a lot of encouragement to move in this direction and a lot of pleasure in having done that.
And how did you move into working with metal?
Well, again, an important point in this career development was seeing really, in one case, a number of pieces in an exhibition that came to the Art Institute while I was a sophomore in college there. And it was a survey of sculpture of the 20th century up until then. This was like about 1954, 55. And it traced the history of modern movements in sculpture. And I saw work of Picasso, Julio Gonzalez, David Smith, people who had a pioneering role in developing direct metal, that is to say welded, fabricated sculpture as an art form. That interested me even more than the modeling that I'd taken to earlier on.
I wanted to interrupt just for a second because when you talk about working directly with metal, tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, traditionally, you know, going back to the Bronze Age, a lot of sculpture in metal had been cast. That is to say, metal melted, poured into molds, and cooled and become bronze or silver sculpture. But in the early 20th century, with the development of welding techniques, which were first based on industrial use, sculptors began to use it to construct, fabricate things that were sheets, rods, various metal forms were altered and welded or soldered together to make sculpture.
When you began doing sculpture, your work was more figurative, and then you moved into more abstract shapes. Can you talk about that transition?
Yeah, the transition from what you might call figurative, making portrait sculpture, sculpture of animals, sculpture of various things, was part of an artist's education at the time I was beginning. I mean, there were not, as there are today, classes in abstraction. There was this possibility, opportunity of my coming of age at a point when abstraction and various other forms of non-literal art were gaining increasing notice and, you know, importance in the field. You know, there was not only abstraction, but surrealism and a branch of that called abstract surrealism, which I found particularly interesting. And then also constructivism, which was a more geometric approach to abstracting. And that is to say, taking from reality, abstracting, taking from reality to create another reality, perhaps, based on ideas, emotions, and the like.
Well, your work often shows this relationship between a natural, organic material and fabricated steel. You seem to be playing with both these things, with the organic material in the way you shape things, and then there's the steel that you fashion in these shapes. Can you just talk about that relationship and how you came to it?
Well, I have this interest both in technologically derived methods of producing things, and like I mentioned earlier, being interested in biological science, but I'm interested in, well, the natural world and how things take shape there, from cell division to various other kinds of growth and expansion. And so part of my creative process is involved, I guess, some of the time with linking the idea of construction in a mechanical way and organic growth, and sort of having a product, these sculptures or other things that I do, that represent and meld the interest in both worlds.
There's a lot of movement in your work.
Yes, movement, of course, is an aspect of being alive and vital. So the idea of suggesting movement seemed appropriate to me. I never have wanted to make art that really moves, that is, say, mobiles or kinetic things, yeah, but things that have a presence that suggests that they might move. Another thing about things that are three-dimensional is that they do in a way move as one eye moves over them or one bodily moves around it. You know, that the relationship of parts changes and suggests things that are different from what one would see at a different angle of perception.
You were quite young when you had your first solo show at the Charles Allen Gallery in New York, and it was about that same time that the Museum of Modern Art bought one of your pieces, making you the first African-American sculptor in their collection.
That's not true that I was the first African-American sculptor in the collection. Later on, I was the first African-American sculptor to have a one-man show. That was in 1971. But in 1956, when the Museum of Modern Art purchased a sculpture of mine, a welded steel sculpture called Arachne, derived from the Greek myth. I mean, it's not that there were a lot of African-American sculptures in the collection, but for instance, there was sculptor Edmondson. There might have been a couple of others.
Well, you're young, you're in your early 20s, and both of these really terrific things are happening for you. What was your thinking at that moment?
Well, I was thinking that was the way they were supposed to happen. I mean, what I mean is, somebody calls you up and say they want to buy a piece of sculpture. Well, fine. Then other people say, well, gee, I'm 40 and nobody's from Museum of Modern Art bought anything of mine. But, well, you start to make comparisons and you see it.
It must have been a heady moment.
Yeah.
How do you develop your pieces? Do you sketch? Do you make molds? Do you make models?
Well, I have several approaches, and it depends on the nature of the particular work, its scale, whether it's commissioned or not. I mean, but generally, there's some idea developed. Sometimes just a mental image, other times a sketch, sometimes, at least as my studio practice developed, to the point that the studio is sort of an environment that is full of possibilities as well as just a place to work. That is to say, I have a lot of material that I've either collected or started to work on or whatnot. And so at any given point, there's something I might start to put together with something else, and it becomes over time a sculpture. Another thing about the way I work, this welded fabricating medium, that is both additive and subtractive, or at least it has that potential. Whereas modeling, you put material together, build up with clay or wax or plaster. And with carving, you take away, you chip away stone or wood. But the flexibility of welded fabricated work is that you can do some of both. The tensile strength of the metals means that you can put things together and extend them into space that you wouldn't do otherwise. So in all of this, for what I would call my self-directed studio work, it's very improvisatory, spontaneous. When I do work that's commissioned for some public place or for some particular purpose, I take a more considered approach, drawing, making models. So there are two approaches, and they merge at times.
Can we talk about a commissioned piece that you created in 1967, your first public sculpture called Play, and the significance about that, your first public sculpture?
Yes, well, I was very fortunate in that This commission play was commissioned by an architect, Walter Netsch, who had first become a collector of my work, even while I was still a student at the Art Institute, but exhibiting in Chicago at a gallery. Anyway, Walter Netsch came to me. He was at work on a hospital, a state hospital, and it just happened to be the first building project in the state that used a Percent for Art program. And knowing my work and being interested in it, he approached me about doing a commission to go out in an open space that was surrounded by various pavilions that were part of this hospital. So it was interesting on several levels. Someone who had had a personal interest in my private work, taking it public, so to speak, and later on, in various ways, I was involved in the promotion of public art and the idea of art in public places.
In a city like Chicago that is rich in public sculpture, it's very easy to find yours. You have many, many works in your hometown of Chicago.
Well, that's true, and I'm happy and proud of that. And the fact that the city has a tradition going way back, and then a kind of post-World War II, resurgence of interest, beginning with the Picasso sculpture in the Daley Plaza and various other pieces. Real history of that sort of thing. So it's kind of natural in a way for somebody interested in making sculpture to find his way into the public places where sculpture is presented.
What are some of the considerations that you have when you're creating a public piece of art?
Certainly making something that has the potential of being more or less permanent is a factor. Then for me, creating something that has a definite sense of belonging in a particular place is important.
You've said that history was something that really interested you a great deal. And in some ways, your sculpture can reference history, though it still remains abstract. And I'm thinking of Jacob's Ladder, which is in the Carter Woodson Library in Chicago.
Yes. The Carter Woodson Library, of course, is named for Carter G. Woodson, who was an African-American historian and who was responsible for first bringing attention to African-American history by having what was then called Negro History Week. Now it's, of course, a month-long celebration. But there's this library, a regional library in Chicago, named for him, and there was a space, an atrium, that seemed to cry out for a piece that would hang from this 30-foot-high glassed-over atrium. As a matter of fact, the space is 30 feet high, 30 feet wide, 30 feet deep, so a cube of space, so to speak. Anyway, in discussions with the architect and the library committee, the idea of a piece that would hang in the space seemed appropriate. So in thinking about something that would hang in the space and it being so dedicated to African-American life and history, this sculpture I call Jacob's Ladder references the Negro spiritual. We are climbing Jacob's ladder, and there's a phrase, climbing Jacob's ladder, that talks about in the African-American community climbing out of ignorance into knowledge and that sort of thing. So it has a resonance both artistically, structurally within the space, and with the intended use of the space.
And you're working on a piece of sculpture that's your homage to Romare Bearden. It's for the city of Charlotte, and it's called Spiral Odyssey.
Yes, the Spiral Odyssey, again, takes its title and some of its form and meaning from the life and activities of Romare Bearden, who was a friend and an influential artist to me and to other people, many other people. And of course, this Romare Bearden Park, where the sculpture will reside, is created as part of a downtown redevelopment and expansion in Charlotte, but it was the ward in which 104 years ago Romare Bearden was born. He was interested in classical literature, as am I, and he did 2, maybe 3 series of works based on the Odyssey. So that's one thing. And then he was active with some other African American artists in starting a group that wanted to encourage and spread interest and understanding of abstraction in art among African Americans. And that group was called Spiral. So the sculpture, which spirals upward and has some sort of boat shapes in it, is a reflection of that.
You mentioned that it's in the Romare Bearden Park in Charlotte, and it's part of a redevelopment and revitalization of that neighborhood in Charlotte. And art has frequently been used, public art particularly, as a way to add to a revitalization process. When that happens, when your art is involved with that, do you feel a particular responsibility, or how do you approach that? Because it's not just seeing what's there, it's also envisioning a future.
Well, yes, I find that approaching art as, beyond personal expression. I mean, just like architecture, it's a place for people to live or work or worship or whatever. But at the same time, the architect expresses something of himself, something of his time. An architect considers a whole lot of things that are part of the building codes in whatever city it is and all that. And the same with sculpture. I mean, that is to say, not to that extent, but to create things that are memorable to see, to congregate around, to be part of making a place more identifiable. Those are things that add to the potential of an artist's work, certainly a sculptor's work.
Tell me about your studio.
Well, my studio is a adaptive reuse of a industrial building, a building that was built as an electrical substation, housed some generators at one point in time. It was vacated, and the only thing left in it, thank goodness, was a crane, an overhead bridge crane that I can use then to move sculpture around and about and out the door. And it was in a part of town that in the early 70s was a little bit derelict. And now it's become, as many places artists have taken up as places to live and work, much more gentrified, so that I'm the only non-conforming place in a neighborhood that's otherwise become a place of loft condominiums and luxury townhomes. But anyway, I'm still there, and the space is still a space that's, a wonderful space to make sculpture in.
I want to talk a little bit about the practicality of what you do. Always.
Who said it was practical?
Well, that's sort of where I'm getting at. I mean, I always feel for sculptors because it is so difficult. Financially, the commitment is so great. If you're not a successful poet, you can typically cobble together a piece of paper and a pen. For a sculptor, it is a monumental cost. It's a big investment. Even if you're working with found objects, you still need the right tools and the equipment. And then, for example, with Spiral Odyssey, I just wonder, how are you moving it?
Well, of course, that's another thing. There's the creation of the work, and then the logistics of getting it, first of all, out of the door. The first large sculpture I made, as a matter of fact, play, I had a problem getting it out of the door. I didn't measure the door. Like the old story of a person building a boat in their basement. But anyway,
Yes.
Over the years, 125 sculptures later, I consider all that as part of the process. So there's the creation of the sculpture, the logistics of moving and installing it, but it becomes part of one's practice over time,
Yeah.
And of course, when you talk about costs, something to be considered over and above just the cost of materials and labor. I mean, additionally, what it takes to get something somewhere, the foundation that's going to keep it upright in winds and storms and even earthquakes up to a certain point.
Right, because some of your work, a lot of your work, your public work is quite big, and you do have to think about wind and how that's going to impact it.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I've picked up a few things along the way, what they call on-the-job training, just like architects and various other kind of design professionals. I consult with the proper people, like structural engineers, sometimes mechanical engineers, when I'm developing the ideas and working on larger scale pieces.
Well, let's journey back 50 years to when you sat on the National Council on the Arts for the Arts Endowment. Tell me about that.
Well, to be accurate, to be perfectly accurate, it's been 48 years out of the 50 that I've been associated with the National Endowment, National Council on the Arts. And so I served from 1968 to 1974. It was a very exciting and exhilarating thing to be part of a group of such notable people in the arts, all of the arts, and to try to think about what this federal program could do nationally to advance the cause of the arts. It was a very meaningful thing for me and actually enlarged my view of what was possible both for individuals and arts organizations.
You were part of that first foundational generation of the National Endowment for the Arts.
Well, yes. You know, along with the council members, the various staff people who were brought in and who had, again, backgrounds in both performing or academic backgrounds and all, and who thought intelligently and deeply about what in their various professions could advance training for persons who wanted to perform or make things, and then bringing the arts to a broader and broader audience.
Can you talk a little bit about the significance of the NEA on the vitality of the culture of this country?
Looking back, it's interesting to think about, well, first of all, the enthusiasm and the expansion of programs. As a matter of fact, one important program, as far as I was concerned, was called Expansion Arts, instituted during the time I was a member, which sought to bring people who were community-based, that is to say, not major arts organizations, but organizations which were nascent and trying to grow, you know, within specific communities, ethnic communities, and communities that were otherwise disadvantaged and had less access to various art forms. That has certainly made a difference, and the difference that could be made by supporting exemplary programs that could then be replicated from one community, one region to another.
Let me ask you, back to you personally, what's next? What are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on several things. You know, we talked about the Bearden Project, closer to the home of the National Endowment, going to be doing a sculpture for the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I'll hope to finish some point next year, about a year from now. I'm working on pieces for University of Iowa and just some sculptures I want to make, things that I go in there and just start putting pieces of metal together.
Well, Richard Hunt, I want to thank you for coming into the studio, for everything that you've done.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk, to reminisce, to look both backwards and forwards.
That was sculptor Richard Hunt. He served on the National Council of the Arts from 1968 to 1974. You can find out if there's a Richard Hunt sculpture in your hometown, or you can just check out his work at richardhunt.us. You've been listening to Artworks, produced at the National Endowment for the Arts. To find out how art works in communities across the country, keep checking the Artworks blog, or follow us at NEA Arts on Twitter. For the National Endowment for the Arts, I'm Josephine Reed. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was Richard, a lot of Richard talking about his own work and what might be the middle of his career. The next, I wish I would have been able to show you some of the sculptures that he was actually talking about, but perhaps if you go to his website, you can find them because they are very, very lovely. But this next short clip, it's a very short clip. It's a brief peek into Hunt's studio and his process. And again, it was done a few years after this last one was done. So we, again, will see his progression.
You don't really have to be inspired to make a sculpture or art
So it's not like you got to go on a mountain and see the sun setting over, on the far horizon and say, oh, you just go in the studio, pick up something, put it together with something else. I'm Richard Hunt, and here we are in my sculpture studio. This building was built in 1909 as an electrical substation for the Chicago Railway Systems Company. In the early 70s, this building, which was then part of the Chicago Transit Authority, was decommissioned. They built a new substation underneath the tracks. A friend of mine who was in the real estate business found out about it and said, I think it would make a great studio. So I've been here since 1971. The cast pieces are made initially in some other material, clay or wax, and then a mold is made from them, and then bronze is poured into the mold. Pieces like this are made from sheets of metal, cut, shaped, welded together. And those are the basic ways that are worked. The work that you're seeing here is not drawn, it's just developed intuitively, improvised. I'll have a shape in my mind, I'll cut one out and then I'll cut another one out, it gets welded to the other one and that sort of thing. In a way, kind of a dialogue between me, the technique, the material, that ends up fashioning itself into what you see around. Work that's sort of self-generated, just out of my head and hands, is just an ongoing process of things getting built and kind of grown.
Well, it doesn't want to progress here. All right, and then finally, we have President Obama, who chose Richard Hunt to do an installation in the garden of the new Presidential Center in Chicago that is, I believe, still under design. I don't think it's finished yet. I mean, the sculptures, I think, might be finished, but so in this next clip, we have Obama, who gives a brief introduction to Richard himself again, and then we will see Richard as he is today.
I think all of us are shaped and changed by art as we grow up. It starts with our earliest memories. As time goes on, there are obviously iconic images that become part of your understanding of the world. And I think that's something that we want to make sure we are honoring in the process of designing and building the Presidential Center, because we want kids on the south side of Chicago or the west side of Chicago to have access to art and to understand that they too are art makers and that they can create amazing work. Part of what makes Chicago a world-class city is its cultural and artistic institutions. And we hope that the Obama Presidential Center will be viewed as part of this amazing tapestry of institutions. We want to be a living, breathing center of activity and a place where people can gather and learn and debate and connect and be inspired. And art does that. And so we're really excited about the incredible number of artists who've expressed an interest in working with us.
Mr. Hunt, what an honor to be with you over Zoom.
Very good.
It's great to see you.
Well, and vice versa. And I'm so glad, that this is a possibility for me. Yeah.
When I was born, my parents lived in Woodlawn, 63rd and Eberhard. I think I was about 4 years old when we moved to Inglewood. There was a Southside Community Arts Center. I took a few classes there. As a kid, my mother took me and my sister to museums, both the Art Institute, the Field Museum. What I saw in those museums made me more aware of various possibilities. I had spent a lot of time, taking art classes. And then when I got a scholarship to go to the Art Institute, then I said, okay, I'm going to be an artist, and in particular, a sculptor. I set up in my parents' basement a little studio to work, then started to exhibit my work in art fairs, and I gave another boost to my career. I guess it was in the 60s where African Americans were, in a lot of areas trying to make inroads. And there were people that picketed and petitioned the Museum of Art and Art and many other museums to exhibit, works of African Americans. It's just beyond the area where the Ida B. Wells public housing was. The concept was to create a sculpture of some scale and, to be somewhat impressive. There's 3 columns that come up that support the sculpture, and then within the columns, plaques that have images of her and some of her choice quotations.
I've been a huge admirer of your work for a long time, and Michelle has as well. To have one of the greatest artists Chicago ever produced to participate in what we hope is an important cultural institution for the city and the South Side, it feels like a pretty good fit to me.
When I was approached by the Obama Presidential Center, I was delighted. It's a real honor and a privilege to have this opportunity. The piece for the library is an elaboration from a piece that I did for an award to supporters of the United Negro College Fund. So it's a book, and it opens up, and there's a bird that comes out singing. I want them to see this book bird, as I call it, as something that encapsulates the progress one can make through reading and study. This book bird helps you to take wings yourself.
It's a beautiful image. Richard, I will tell you that it immediately spoke to me as a powerful image that fits the space, and is a message, obviously, that's consistent with what we're trying to do with the Presidential Center generally and the library in particular. It speaks to the space in a way that would be compelling to visitors and to the residents of the community alike.
There are a range of possibilities for art on public buildings or in public places to commemorate, to inspire. I think art can enliven and kind of set certain standards for what's going on in and around it and within the community. Now, here within Woodlawn is this world-class place that kids can go to. It's an opportunity for a community to absorb information and inspiration from something that's right in their midst.
And that's all I have for you today on Richard Hunt. There is, as I said earlier, he is extremely prolific. Much of my material I got from a recent book that was published titled, it was 70 years of his work. And Phil has it right now, is borrowing it to look through. So it's very, very full of his work. And more information on him. But it was a very wonderful journey, and I'm glad I researched all of this. So Does anybody have any questions? I know we're running a little early this time, but does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to come off mute or raise your hand in the raise your hand feature. It looks like Ben Hancock has a question. Go ahead, Ben.
Nancy, first of all, thank you so much for for providing this information. I have to admit that I knew very little about Richard Hunt, so this has been very very delightful and educational and inspiring. So thank you. How did you go about selecting him, and what led to your journey that embraced Richard Hunt?
Well, that's an interesting story because, like you, I was not familiar with Richard Hunt, and as I mentioned in the beginning, I studied art from my undergraduate work all the way through. I taught it. I've been in the business for 50 years probably. So, and I just have not been that familiar with him. So actually, Phil Stockton, our HAS member, a recent member of the group, worked for the Encyclopedia Britannica, producing films in the 70s. And he was on the team, is that correct? That produced that first film I showed you. And he brought it to the attention of Sarah, the Fine Arts Committee. And
Right.
they called me and said, would I try to pull this all together? And when I began, there was not much available on his information. It was a challenge in the beginning. I went down to the Crassel there. I knew he had some work down there. It was absolutely lovely. I took some of the photographs, but I wasn't able to, and they even published a book, but they didn't have it anymore. And so I was sort of chasing around West Michigan, went out to the archive in Ann Arbor, took some photos out there. Still came up with only that. But as time went on, things started to peek into my world. And all of a sudden, one day I found his website, and it was just a marvelous piece of information filled with videos, clips from interviews over time. Chicago television stations did a lot of interviews, and one of them in particular I had in, and I pulled it because I felt that the art historian was kind of badgering him to admit that he was Black, and that was the reason for his success. But I read that book. I'm not all of it, but quite a bit of it. It's a very thick book. But I really felt that's not the case. I mean, he just felt that he was an artist, and if he was right for the location, he was the right person, whether it was a Black college, Howard University, or whether it was a public space in a major city. So I came to admire him quite a bit as I've gone through it.
Well, thank you. I think it's also interesting he's a little bit older than our generation per se, depending. I know we have quite a range at HAS, but
yes,
it's interesting to kind of think through that period, his journey, because each of us has a journey, has a story. Each of us are going through some of the same experiences of how do we basically integrate our interests. In his case, he talked about art and biology.
Yes.
And I think a lot of us have integrated practices of some sort or another. So to hear him talk about that intersection, I think each of us has multiple intersections during our life. So I felt it a very good story for us, for each of us.
He also took many of his titles of his pieces from literature, recent and past, or poetry. And I thought that was interesting because it didn't necessarily relate to the space it was in, but the piece he produced just brought to his mind some of that, some of that literature. So I can't believe how much time that man must have spent in his studio to produce what he did. And for the numerous locations that he has his work in addition to just doing what he wanted to do. He has a number of pieces going. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Dave and Jane Armstrong, but they own DeGraff Studio DeGraff Art Gallery in Saugatuck. And Jane has been very, very involved in arts in this community. And they have a Hunt piece in their house. I didn't get down to photograph it, but it's a wall piece. It's not it's not a giant sculpture, but it's very wonderful. And Dave talks about going down to try to buy something, and he couldn't come to an agreement with Hunt or Hunt's people on the piece. So, but yeah.
Well, thank you for the question, Ben, and for the comment. Thank you, Nancy, for the response. I just wanted to relay a comment here from Kathy Colton from the chat window that says, interesting that Richard Hunt said, and this is paraphrased from his second video, that he doesn't need to see something beautiful in nature to inspire him, that he can just go into his studio and just put things together. And Kathy says his imagination must be fascinating. And I agree with that assertion. I had a quick question for you, Nancy, here. I was interested to hear Richard say that when he's building these sculptures, he doesn't think of building anything that's mobile. He doesn't see his work infuses the theme of mobility and movement, but he never does anything that actually moves itself. So I was curious, any of the projects that you saw in your research or in your visiting to get pictures, any of those that you saw that would have been interesting to be mobile, or anything that you really appreciated about those that you did see?
Yes, he did. I think it's in Atlanta. He did an installation of floating sculpture. It literally, he built it on like a raft. It's huge. And it literally floats in this sort of lagoon I think it is in the Atlanta area. My brother lives down there, so I'd love to go see that next time I'm down there. But it was quite interesting. Yeah, he did in that case for some reason want to do a floating piece. He's not a mobile like Alexander Calder at all. He's never gone in that direction. But a lot of his pieces seem to challenge gravity. They extend out and cantilever out. All of that we've seen here were more vertical, but he has quite a few. In the Crassel piece, there are two pieces and it forms a bridge. You actually walk underneath it. So he implies movement, and I think that's his real thing. But he's had some involvement with water and movement and that sort of thing. But yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from those who are in attendance for Nancy and her research on Richard Hunt?
Hi, Nancy. This is Sue Donnelly.
Hi, Sue. How are you?
Yeah, good. Listen, he had some significant teachers and influences early on that seemed to make a lot of difference to him. Do you know if in the course of his career, he did any mentoring of younger sculptors coming along?
I could not find evidence of that. And that's what I mentioned earlier, even though he majored in art education. He never did do any teaching. All of the videos I've seen of his studio do have various people, younger staff working, especially now over the last probably 10 years. But he doesn't make reference to it at all. And I haven't heard anybody talking about that, but yeah, it'd be interesting. He certainly has a lot to contribute, or could have over the years. So
right. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Stu. Anyone else? So this is your last call for questions for Nancy on the subject of Richard Hunt. Well, seeing none and seeing no one coming off mute to suggest, I just wanted to thank you all for joining. If you have additional questions for Nancy, feel free to email her and connect with her that way if you want to share anything or any comments or potentially ask any further questions. But at this time, we'll send you all away and just want to say thank you to Nancy and to Phil for their organization of this course and for supplying materials for the course, and hope you all get out and enjoy the beautiful weather that we have here this afternoon. Thank you. Looks like Ben already is. He's outside enjoying the weather. So I would recommend doing something similar to him. But thank you all for joining and have a great rest of your day.